And our question at this time concerns a statement or a phrase that's found in the book of 1 Timothy in chapter 5. In 1 Timothy chapter 5, we see the Apostle Paul writing to Timothy and speaking things concerning Timothy's behavior and conduct toward older men, older women, younger women, and younger men, and so forth. And then begins to speak about the widows, and the widows that he might encounter, those sisters in Christ who have obviously lost a husband. Well, as you go down through it speaks about this woman also saying that there is a warning to be found. Verse 5 says, "And she is a widow indeed, and desolate trusteth in God, and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. But," verse 6, "she that liveth in pleasure is dead while she liveth." And the question came to me was, what does that mean, being dead while you live? And that is a good question. Whenever you first look at this, at first glance, you say, well, how could somebody be dead and then living? How can you be dead and alive at the same time? Well, that is confusing if we think about it from strictly a physical standpoint. That is to say, someone physically dead and then physically alive at the same time. But please understand, that's not the language being used here. When he talks about she that lives in pleasure is dead while she lives, that the dead there, that part of the verse, is talking about a spiritual death. While she lives, in other words, while she's still alive on earth. Now, please understand, to talk about death, or to talk about the word dead itself, the word dead just means a separation. That's all it means. And so you can have, such as James chapter 5 talks about, and there, the last verse of James 5, where he talks about in verse 26, the body without the spirit is dead. In other words, there's a separation between body and spirit. It produced a physical death. It's a separation. That's all that it is. And so in this case, we're not talking about a physical death, but a spiritual death. Somebody, in this case, who was living in pleasures. Now the word pleasure there has to do with sinful pleasure, has to do with hedonism, has to do with that type of thing. Those who live in pleasures, he says, is dead while she lives. She is spiritually dead. She is separated from God, though alive on earth. And that's what you find here. That's how you can have someone dead and alive at the same time. He's talking about a spiritual death and while still being physically alive. And we see this, several occasions we can find this in the Bible where it talks about folks who were spiritually dead. They were dead spiritually, but alive, obviously physically. Now that's something we've got to guard against. That's something that we've got to stay away from. See, our purpose in life, your and my purpose in life, is not to be spiritually dead while living on earth, but rather to be spiritually alive while on earth. That's the key. That's what needs to happen. And that's in fact what's being encouraged here. Now, Timothy, you need to be watchful, and you need to treat folks in a certain way, and certain things have to be in accordance with God's will, so that people will be alive. They will be spiritually alive. And that's the point. That's what we find being discussed here in the book of Romans chapter 6, for example. Romans chapter 6 and verses 3 and 4 speaks about folks who, he said, were baptized. He said, "Know ye not as many as us were baptized into Jesus Christ, were baptized into his death. Therefore we are buried with him by baptism into death, that like as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, even so we also should walk in newness of life." There's your spiritual life. He says whenever someone's baptized into Christ, he said just as Christ died and was buried and he rose, so also you take someone who's been spiritually dead. They're separated from God. But you can take that person, baptize them into Christ, and then they rise to walk in newness of life. They're spiritually alive. That person then must live faithfully to the Lord. And that's where the encouragement is concerning Timothy with those widows and anyone else, to make sure they stay spiritually alive, to be faithful unto death. Revelation 2:10 says, "And I'll give thee a crown of life." 1 Corinthians 15 talks about this as well. And so that's the thing we need to remember. Make sure that we're not dead while we live on earth, but spiritually alive, so we can gain a spiritual, eternal home in heaven one day.